A billionaire handed her unlimited credit card to a poor single father for 24 hours, then walked away. No strings. No conditions. Less than an hour later, her phone lit up with the first transaction. Not luxury goods, not a 5-star hotel. The next charges made her breath catch because they revealed nothing about greed. They revealed something that made her chest tighten with shame. When the 24 hours ended, the man appeared again. His final act broke her. What he did in those hours wasn't what she expected. It was what she feared she'd lost forever. The downtown bus station smelled like diesel and old coffee. Alyssa Monroe sat in her black sedan across the street, waiting for her driver to return from the restroom. She didn't usually wait in places like this. Her world existed in boardrooms with floor-to-ceiling windows, in penthouses where silence cost extra, in restaurants where reservations required 3 months and a referral. But today her schedule had cracked open, and she found herself watching strangers move through a space she'd forgotten existed. She noticed the man because he wasn't moving. Everyone else rushed toward buses or taxis, dragging suitcases and screaming into phones. He sat on a wooden bench near the far wall, shoulders hunched, one hand resting on the head of a small boy beside him. The boy looked up at his father and said something. The man shook his head. The boy asked again. The man reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a crumpled bill, and handed it to the child. The boy ran toward a vending machine. Alyssa watched the man lean back and close his eyes. His jacket was too thin for November. His boots were cracked along the sides. The boy returned with a bag of chips and a bottle of water. He tore open the chips and offered the bag to his father. The man shook his head again. The boy insisted, holding the bag higher. The man smiled, took a single chip, and ruffled the boy's hair. Then he watched his son eat. It was such a small thing. But Alyssa couldn't look away. The boy ate slowly, methodically, like someone who knew food didn't come easy. The man didn't touch the chips again. He just sat there, hands folded in his lap, watching his son with an expression Alyssa couldn't name. Not sadness, not regret. Something quieter, something that looked like surrender. Her driver returned and opened the door. She didn't get in. She told him to wait another 5 minutes. He nodded without asking why. That was what she paid him for. She kept watching. The boy finished the chips and looked up at his father. The man checked his watch, then stood and took the boy's hand. They walked toward the exit. Alyssa didn't think. She opened her door and followed. They stopped outside near the taxi stand. The boy tugged on his father's sleeve and pointed toward a bakery across the street. The man crouched down to eye level and spoke softly. The boy nodded, but his face fell. The man squeezed his shoulder, then straightened and pulled out his phone. He stared at the screen for a long moment, then put it back in his pocket. They started walking. Alyssa followed from a distance. She didn't know why. She'd built an empire on logic and numbers, on predicting human behavior through data and patterns. She didn't do impulsive. She didn't chase strangers through city streets, but something about the way that man moved, the way he carried himself despite the weight pressing down on him, pulled at a part of her she thought she'd buried years ago. They walked 6 blocks. The boy's steps grew slower. The man picked him up and carried him on his back. Alyssa stayed far enough behind that they wouldn't notice. They turned into a narrow street lined with old apartment buildings. The man stopped in front of one with peeling paint and a broken railing. He set the boy down, fished a key from his pocket, and unlocked the front door. Before they went inside, the boy looked back down the street. Alyssa stepped behind a parked truck. When she looked again, they were gone. She stood there for a full minute, staring at the building. Then she walked back to her car. Her driver asked if everything was all right. She told him yes. She told him to take her home. But she didn't stop thinking about that man, or the way he'd given his son the last of his money without hesitation, or the quiet dignity in his refusal to take a single chip. That night, Alyssa couldn't sleep. She sat in her penthouse living room with a glass of wine she didn't drink, looking out at the city lights below. She'd spent 15 years building her wealth. She'd started with nothing, worked her way through business school on scholarships and night shifts, clawed her way into investment banking, and eventually launched her own firm. She believed in meritocracy. She believed people got what they worked for. She believed poverty was often a choice, or at least a consequence of poor decisions. But she also believed most people, when given the chance, would take more than they needed. She'd seen it countless times. Employees padding expense reports, partners siphoning funds, investors lying about losses, charity cases who returned for more handouts the moment the first check cleared. Poverty didn't make people noble. It made them desperate. And desperation made people selfish. That man on the bench had looked desperate. But he hadn't looked selfish. He'd looked like someone who'd made peace with going without. And that bothered her more than she wanted to admit. Because if he was an exception, it meant her rules were incomplete. And if he wasn't an exception, it meant she'd been wrong about something fundamental for a very long time. She made a decision. It was reckless and unscientific and completely unlike her. But she wanted to know. She needed to know. She picked up her phone and called her assistant. She gave instructions. She described the man and the building and asked for a name. Her assistant hesitated, then said she'd have it by morning. Alyssa thanked her and hung up. The next day, she had a file on her desk. Caleb Turner, 41 years old, freelance handyman, single father. Wife died 3 years ago from cancer. Medical debt, eviction notices, no family support. One son, Noah, age 7. The boy attended public school 4 blocks from their apartment. Caleb took whatever jobs he could find, mostly cash under the table, because nobody wanted to hire someone without a permanent address. Alyssa closed the file and stared at the wall. Then she opened her desk drawer and pulled out one of her credit cards. It was linked to a discretionary account she used for occasional personal expenses. No limit. No oversight. She slipped it into an envelope, wrote a note, and sealed it. Then she called her driver. She found Caleb 2 hours later at a construction site downtown. He was hauling plywood up a scaffold, his breath visible in the cold air. She waited until he came down for a water break. Then she approached. He looked at her like she'd appeared out of nowhere, which she had. She introduced herself. He wiped his hand on his jeans before shaking hers. She handed him the envelope. He stared at it, confused. She told him to open it. He did. Inside was the credit card and a handwritten note. The note said he had 24 hours to use the card however he wanted. No restrictions, no questions, no consequences. When the time was up, he could keep whatever he bought, or return the card. His choice. Caleb looked at the card, then at her, then back at the card. He asked if this was some kind of joke. She told him it wasn't. He asked why. She said she wanted to see what he'd do. He asked what she expected him to do. She said she didn't know. That was the point. He held the card like it might explode. Then he asked what the catch was. She told him there was no catch. He didn't believe her. She could see it in his eyes. Nobody gave away something for nothing. Nobody handed a stranger unlimited money and walked away. But she did exactly that. She checked her watch. 2 o'clock in the afternoon. She told him the clock started now. Then she turned and left before he could argue. She sat in her car and watched him through the windshield. He stood there for a long time, staring at the card in his hand. Then he pulled out his phone and made a call. She couldn't hear what he said, but she saw his face change. He ended the call, looked at the card again, and slipped it into his pocket. Then he went back to work. Alyssa told her driver to take her to the office, but she didn't go inside. She sat in the parking garage and opened the banking app on her phone. She'd linked the card to her account with real-time notifications. Every transaction would ping her immediately. She wanted to see the exact moment Caleb decided what kind of man he really was. The first notification came 47 minutes later. Alyssa stared at her phone screen. The notification glowed in the dim light of her car. Target, $32.16. She opened the detailed transaction report. Children's clothing department. She sat back and exhaled slowly. Not a luxury watch, not a down payment on a car. Children's clothing. She told herself it proved nothing. Of course, he'd buy something for his son first. That was strategic. Build sympathy. Establish need. Then the real spending would start. She'd seen this pattern before. Small purchases to justify the large ones. A few practical items before the flat-screen television and the designer sneakers. She kept her phone in her hand and waited. The second notification came 18 minutes later. Walgreens, $47.83. She clicked through. Prescription medication, children's ibuprofen, first aid supplies. She zoomed in on the itemized list. Bandages, antibacterial ointment, a digital thermometer. Nothing excessive. Nothing wasteful. Alyssa set her phone on the passenger seat and started the car. She told her driver she'd take it from here. He looked surprised but nodded and got out. She drove toward downtown, toward the address in Caleb's file. She didn't know what she expected to find. Maybe she just needed to see this with her own eyes. She parked half a block from his building and waited. 30 minutes passed. Then she saw him. Caleb walked down the street with 2 shopping bags in his hands. Noah walked beside him, holding his father's jacket. They stopped at the front door. Caleb set the bags down and unlocked it. Noah grabbed one bag and carried it inside. Caleb picked up the other and followed. Alyssa got out of her car and walked closer. She stayed across the street, partially hidden behind a row of parked vehicles. Through the ground floor window, she could see movement inside. Caleb knelt in front of Noah and pulled something from one of the bags. A winter coat. Dark blue with a hood. He helped Noah put it on. The boy's face lit up. He zipped it up and down several times, testing it. Caleb smiled and said something that made Noah laugh. Then Caleb reached into the second bag. He pulled out the medicine and the first aid supplies. He opened the ibuprofen and shook 2 tablets into his palm. Noah tilted his head back and swallowed them with water from a cup Caleb handed him. Caleb touched the boy's forehead with the back of his hand, then smoothed his hair. Noah wrapped his arms around his father's waist. Caleb held him there for a long moment. Alyssa felt something twist in her chest. She turned away and walked back to her car. She sat behind the wheel and checked her phone. No new notifications. She looked at the time. 4:30 in the afternoon. 2.5 hours had passed since she'd given him the card. 21.5 hours remained. She started the car and drove home. That evening, she tried to work. She had quarterly reports to review and investor calls to prepare for, but she kept checking her phone. The third notification came at 6:42. Grocery store, $81.34. She pulled up the receipt. Milk, eggs, bread, chicken, rice, vegetables, peanut butter, a bag of apples. Everything a family needed for a week, nothing extravagant. The fourth notification came at 7:15. School supply store, $53.12. Notebooks, pencils, a backpack, a lunchbox with cartoon characters on it, crayons, glue sticks. Items for a 7-year-old boy who probably carried his books in a plastic bag. Alyssa set her phone face down on her desk. She stood and walked to the window. The city stretched out below her, lights blinking in the darkness like scattered stars. She'd built her empire on the belief that people were predictable. That self-interest was the only reliable constant. That given unlimited resources, most people would reveal their greed within hours. But Caleb wasn't following the pattern. He wasn't buying anything for himself. Not a meal, not a drink, not even a cup of coffee. She picked up her phone and scrolled through the transactions again. 4 purchases. 4 practical necessities. Nothing personal. Nothing selfish. She told herself he was pacing himself, testing the limits, seeing if the card actually worked before he made his real move. But the thought felt hollow even as she formed it. The 5th notification came at 9:37. She'd gone to bed but couldn't sleep. She grabbed her phone from the nightstand. Gas station, $28. She sat up. Finally. Something for himself. She opened the details. Gasoline. Not food. Not cigarettes. Not beer. Just fuel. She lay back down and stared at the ceiling. She woke the next morning to sunlight streaming through her windows. She grabbed her phone immediately. No new notifications overnight. She checked the time. 7:15. 17 hours had passed since she'd given Caleb the card. 7 hours remained. She canceled her meetings. She told her assistant she was working from home. Then she got in her car and drove back to Caleb's neighborhood. She didn't know what she was doing. She didn't know what she expected to accomplish. But she couldn't sit still. She needed to understand. She found his building and parked in the same spot as before. She waited. At 8:23, Caleb and Noah emerged from the front door. Noah wore his new coat and carried his new backpack. Caleb walked him down the street toward the bus stop. They stood together until the school bus arrived. Caleb knelt down and adjusted Noah's hood. The boy said something that made Caleb smile. Then Noah climbed onto the bus. Caleb watched it drive away before turning back toward home. Alyssa got out of her car and crossed the street. She called his name. He stopped and turned. Recognition crossed his face, followed by something that looked like discomfort. He walked toward her slowly, hands in his pockets. She asked how things were going. He said fine. She asked if the card was working properly. He said yes. She asked if he'd needed anything else. He looked at her like he was trying to solve a puzzle. Then he asked why she was here. She didn't have a good answer. She told him she wanted to make sure everything was all right. He nodded slowly, but she could see he didn't believe her. He asked if she was tracking the purchases. She said yes. He asked if that was part of the test. She said there was no test. He gave her a look that said he knew better. Then he reached into his jacket and pulled out the credit card. He held it out to her. She didn't take it. He said he appreciated what she was trying to do, but he didn't feel right using it anymore. She asked why. He said because it felt like charity. And he didn't want his son growing up thinking they needed handouts to survive. Alyssa told him he had 7 hours left. He said he didn't need 7 hours. She asked what he'd bought so far. He listed the items: coat, medicine, food, school supplies, gas to get to a job interview next week. That was it. She asked if there was anything else he needed. He said there was plenty he needed, but needing something and taking something weren't the same thing. She felt the ground shift under her. She'd spent years building walls around herself, constructing a worldview that made sense, that justified her success and explained other people's failures. But this man, standing in front of her in his worn-out jacket and cracked boots, had just dismantled her logic with a single sentence. She asked what he meant. Caleb looked down the street where the bus had disappeared. He said he'd been poor his entire adult life. He'd worked every day since he was 16. He'd done everything right, stayed out of trouble, finished high school, got married, found work. But his wife got sick, and the medical bill swallowed everything they'd saved. Then she died, and he had a son to raise alone. No family, no support. Just him and Noah against a world that didn't care if they made it or not. He said he could take her money and fix everything temporarily. Pay off debts, get a better apartment, buy Noah everything he'd ever wanted. But what would that teach his son? That someone else would always come along to save them? That they didn't have to fight their own battles? He said he'd rather Noah learn to stand on his own, even if it meant standing in the cold. Alyssa didn't know what to say. She'd prepared for anger, for defensiveness, for justification. But not for this. Not for a man who refused help because accepting it would compromise something he valued more than comfort. She asked what he valued. He looked at her directly. Dignity, he said. Self-respect. The knowledge that whatever he had, he'd earned. That when his son looked at him, he saw a man who fought for what he had, not a man who took what was offered. He said poverty was brutal, but it was honest. It didn't lie to you. It didn't pretend to be something it wasn't. And he'd take honest poverty over dishonest wealth any day. She told him keeping the card for the full 24 hours didn't make him dishonest. He smiled, but it was sad. He said, maybe not. But it made him dependent, and dependence was its own kind of poverty. He held the card out again. This time, she took it. Then something happened she didn't expect. Caleb asked if she had children. She said no. He asked if she had family. She said no. He asked if she was happy. She didn't answer. He nodded like her silence confirmed something he'd suspected. Then he said, money solved problems, but it didn't create meaning. And without meaning, wealth was just weight. He thanked her for her generosity. He said he hoped she found whatever she was looking for. Then he walked back toward his building. Alyssa stood there holding the credit card, watching him go. Her phone buzzed. She looked down. Another notification. She opened it. Educational supply store. $74. Before she'd stopped him, he'd made one more purchase. She pulled up the receipt. Workbooks, reading materials, math flashcards. Science kit. Everything to help a 7-year-old catch up in school. Everything to give a child a fighting chance. She looked up, but Caleb had already gone inside. Alyssa walked back to her car. She sat behind the wheel and pulled up the transaction history. 6 purchases. She calculated the total. 32 plus 47 plus 81 plus 53 plus 28 plus 74. $315.45. In 18 hours, with unlimited access to her money, he'd spent less than what she paid for a single dinner. And every cent had gone to his son, or to their basic survival. She designed this experiment to confirm what she already believed, that poverty and greed were inseparable, that desperation stripped away morality, that anyone, given the chance, would take more than they deserved. But Caleb had proven her wrong, not by taking nothing, by taking only what he needed and refusing what he wanted, by drawing a line between necessity and excess and refusing to cross it. Her phone buzzed again. She looked down, expecting another transaction, but it was a text from an unknown number. She opened it. The message said, "There's a family in Unit 12. Single mother, 2 kids, no heat. If you are still giving away money, they need it more than I do." Below the message was an address, the same building where Caleb lived. Alyssa sat in her car and read the message 3 times. Then she started the engine. She drove to the building and found Unit 12. She knocked. A woman answered. She looked tired and suspicious. Alyssa introduced herself and asked if she needed help with heating. The woman's face changed. She asked how Alyssa knew. Alyssa said a neighbor told her. The woman invited her inside. The apartment was freezing. 2 children sat on a couch wrapped in blankets. Alyssa called a heating company and paid for emergency repair. She paid 3 months of the woman's rent. She paid for groceries and winter clothes for the children. The woman cried and asked why. Alyssa said because someone asked her to. When she left, she checked her phone. 1 new transaction. $50. A children's bookstore. She pulled up the receipt. Used books. 5 of them. Picture books and early readers. She looked at the timestamp. Caleb had made the purchase while she was inside Unit 12, while he was supposed to be done using the card. She called the number that had sent her the text. Caleb answered. She asked why he was still using the card. He said he forgot to give it back. She said that wasn't what she meant. She asked why he bought books. He said Noah loved to read. But the library was far, and they didn't always have time to get there. He wanted his son to have books of his own, something permanent. She asked why he'd sent her to Unit 12. He said because she'd wanted to help someone, and that family needed help more than he did. She asked how he knew she'd actually go. He said he didn't, but he figured it was worth trying. Then he said he'd drop the card off at her office before 2 o'clock. She told him to keep it until the time was up. He said there were 4 hours left and he was done shopping. She told him to keep it anyway. He didn't argue. He thanked her again and hung up. Alyssa drove home in silence. When she got there, she poured a glass of wine and stood at her window. She thought about Caleb and Noah, about the woman in Unit 12 and her children, about all the people she'd spent years judging from a distance, about how easy it was to create theories about poverty when you'd never had to choose between food and medicine. Her phone buzzed one last time. She looked at the screen. The final transaction, $42. She opened it. A toy store. One item. A birthday present. She checked the date in Caleb's file. Noah's birthday was in 3 days. Caleb had used the last of his time to buy his son a gift he couldn't afford on his own. She looked at the total now. 315 plus 50 plus 42. $407.45. In 24 hours, with unlimited access to wealth, he'd spent the equivalent of what she paid her housekeeper for a week. Alyssa set her phone down and closed her eyes. The test was over, but she wasn't sure who had failed it. Alyssa didn't sleep that night. She sat in her living room with the lights off, watching the city breathe below her. Every car that passed, every window that flickered on or off, every person moving through the darkness toward somewhere they needed to be. She'd lived above all of this for so long she'd forgotten what it looked like from the ground. She thought about Caleb's question. If she was happy. She'd built a company worth $400 million. She employed 300 people. She sat on the boards of 5 major corporations. She had properties in 3 cities and investment portfolios that generated more money in a month than most people earned in a lifetime. But when he'd asked if she was happy, she hadn't been able to answer, because the truth was she didn't know. She'd been so focused on building and acquiring and succeeding that she'd never stopped to ask herself what any of it meant. She had wealth, she had power, she had respect, but she didn't have anyone to share it with. No partner, no children, no family. Just employees who needed her signature and colleagues who wanted her connections. When she left the office each night, she went home to an empty penthouse and ate dinner alone. She'd convinced herself that was strength, independence, freedom from the complications that dragged other people down. But sitting there in the dark, watching a city full of strangers, she wondered if she'd just been afraid of needing anyone, afraid of being vulnerable, afraid of caring about something she couldn't control with contracts and quarterly projections. Caleb had everything to lose and nothing to gain. But he'd chosen dignity over desperation. He'd drawn a line and refused to cross it, even when crossing it would have solved every problem he had. And in doing so, he'd exposed something in her she didn't want to see. That all her wealth hadn't bought her the one thing he had. Purpose. The kind that came from loving something more than you loved your own comfort. When morning came, she called her office and cleared her schedule. Then she got dressed and drove to Caleb's building. The 24 hours would be up at 2 o'clock that afternoon. She arrived at 1:45 and waited outside. At 1:58, Caleb appeared at the building entrance. He saw her car and walked over. She got out and stood in front of him. She told him the 24 hours were up. He nodded and reached into his jacket. He pulled out the credit card and held it out to her. She took it and looked at it. $407.45. That was what unlimited access to wealth had cost him. She asked if he'd bought everything he needed. He said he'd bought everything he could justify. She asked what the difference was. He said, need was about survival. Justification was about living with yourself afterward. He'd needed a lot of things: a new jacket, dental work, a security deposit on a better apartment. But he couldn't justify spending someone else's money on things he should earn himself. Alyssa told him he could have kept using the card, that she'd meant what she said about no conditions. He said he knew. But conditions weren't the problem. The problem was what taking without earning did to a person. It made them smaller, made them dependent, made them forget they were capable of taking care of themselves. He said he'd seen too many people lose themselves that way. He wouldn't do it to himself, and he wouldn't model it for his son. She asked what he wanted Noah to learn. Caleb looked down the street toward the bus stop. He said he wanted Noah to learn that life was hard, but hard didn't mean hopeless. That being poor didn't mean being powerless. That dignity wasn't something you bought. It was something you carried. And the moment you traded it for convenience, you'd lost something you couldn't get back. Alyssa felt her throat tighten. She asked what he would do now. He said the same thing he did every day. Find work. Feed his son. Keep going. She asked if that was enough. He smiled, and it was the saddest smile she'd ever seen. He said it had to be. Then he thanked her for the experiment and turned to leave. She called his name. He stopped. She told him she'd learned something from him. He asked what. She said she'd learned that poverty wasn't what she thought it was, that the people she'd spent years judging from a distance were fighting battles she couldn't imagine, that her theories about human nature were built on a foundation she'd never tested, and that he'd done something in 24 hours she hadn't done in 20 years. He'd shown her what integrity looked like. Caleb studied her face. Then he asked why she'd really given him the card. She told him the truth. She said she'd wanted to prove people were selfish, that given the chance, anyone would take more than they deserved, that her success was justified because she'd earned it in a world full of people who would have taken it if they could. But he'd proven her wrong, and she didn't know what to do with that. He asked what she was going to do now. She said she didn't know. He said that was probably a good place to start. Then he reached into his other pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He handed it to her. She unfolded it. It was a receipt from a non-profit organization. He'd donated $50, not from her card, from his own account, the last money he had until his next job came through. She looked up at him. He said his wife had taught him something before she died, that wealth wasn't measured by what you had. It was measured by what you gave when you had nothing. The nonprofit helped families pay for medical bills, the kind of bills that had destroyed his own family. He said if he couldn't help himself yet, at least he could help someone else, even if it was just $50, even if it meant he'd be eating rice and beans for the next week. Alyssa felt something break inside her chest. She tried to speak but couldn't. Caleb told her she didn't need to say anything. He said people like her built the world. People like him just tried to survive in it. But maybe, sometimes, the builders needed to remember what they were building for. Then he walked away. She stood there holding the receipt and the credit card. The two pieces of paper felt like they weighed 1,000 pounds. She walked back to her car and sat behind the wheel. Then she did something she hadn't done in 15 years. She cried. She cried for the family she'd never built, for the connections she'd never made, for the years she'd spent accumulating things that didn't matter while ignoring the things that did. She cried for Caleb and Noah, living in a freezing apartment and fighting every day just to stay above water. She cried for the woman in Unit 12 and her children, for every person she'd judged without understanding, for every assumption she'd made from the comfort of her penthouse. When she was done, she wiped her face and started the car. She drove to her office and called an emergency meeting with her executive team. She told them she was starting a new initiative. A foundation to help working families cover emergency expenses, medical bills, rent, utilities, school supplies. Not charity, not handouts. A safety net for people who worked hard but couldn't catch a break. People like Caleb. Her CFO asked how much she planned to allocate. She said $10 million to start. He looked shocked. She told him she'd made her money by betting on people. It was time she bet on the right ones. Then she made another call. To Caleb. He answered on the third ring. She told him she had a job opening. Building maintenance supervisor for her company's properties. Steady hours, health insurance, benefits. A salary that would let him and Noah move somewhere safe. He didn't respond for a long moment. Then he asked why she was doing this. She said because she'd learned something else from him. That the strongest people weren't the ones who never needed help. They were the ones who knew how to accept it without losing themselves. And she wanted to work with people like that. People who understood what mattered. He asked if this was charity. She said no. It was an investment in the kind of person she wanted to be. He accepted the job. 2 weeks later, he and Noah moved into a new apartment. Not fancy, but clean, warm, safe. Alyssa helped them move. She carried boxes up 3 flights of stairs and assembled furniture and ordered pizza for dinner. Noah showed her his new room. He'd hung his books on a shelf his father built. He told her his dad said books were the most important thing a person could own, because they taught you how to think. She asked what he wanted to be when he grew up. He said he wanted to be like his dad. Someone who helped people. She asked what his dad had taught him. He said his dad taught him that being poor didn't mean being small, and that taking care of people was more important than taking care of yourself. Then he hugged her and thanked her for being his dad's friend. Alyssa left that night and drove home, but her penthouse didn't feel empty anymore. It felt like a place she was visiting, a place she'd built for someone she used to be. She stood at her window and looked down at the city. Somewhere out there, Caleb and Noah were eating dinner. Somewhere out there, the woman from Unit 12 was keeping her children warm. Somewhere out there, people were fighting battles she'd never see. She picked up her phone and opened her banking app. She looked at the transaction history from 24 hours that had changed everything. $407.45. The cost of proving herself wrong. The cost of learning what wealth really meant. The cost of understanding that the poorest man she'd ever met had been richer than she'd ever been. She closed the app and set her phone down. Then she did something she hadn't done in years. She called her assistant and asked her to research volunteer opportunities. Homeless shelters, food banks, places where money wasn't enough, where presence mattered, where showing up meant something. Because Caleb had taught her the most important lesson of all. That wealth without purpose was just numbers on a screen. But purpose without wealth was still worth everything. And somewhere between those two truths, she might finally find the answer to the question he'd asked. If she was happy. She wasn't there yet. But for the first time in 20 years, she thought she might be heading in the right direction.